Western Marxism, section, The Long Struggle Against the World Colonial Slavery System. We are forced to rethink the picture painted by Marx of history in the theory of emancipation. For him, before the decisive revolution that would bring about social emancipation, the starting point was identifying with the U.S.-American Revolution, which brought about the country of complete political emancipation, and with the French Revolution, which put political emancipation on the agenda for all of Europe. In reality, we have seen that the revolt of the colonies resulting in the founding of the United States was more of a counter-revolution, so far as the relations with the colonized peoples or those of colonial origin were concerned. These relations must be the center of our attention for two reasons. It is in the colonies that the harshest system of power emerged, often involving slavery and even genocide against the subject peoples, and suffering under this system of power was the vast majority of humanity. We must then take note of the fact that it was the revolution of the black slaves of Saint Domingue, led by Toussaint Louverture, that inflicted the first blow against the world colonialist slavery system. If we want to continue to identify the French Revolution as the starting point of the gigantic conflict between emancipation and de-emancipation that runs through contemporary history, we will have to date it differently from the traditional way, finding in 1789 to 91 the beginning of a gigantic upheaval, and so intersecting in a single process the overthrow of the Ancien regime in France and the uprising against slavery and colonial domination in Saint Domingue. We can describe the nature of the world colonialist slavery system, giving the floor to witnesses and authors who were anything but extraneous to the liberal West. Here is a liberal British historian in the middle of the 19th century, calling attention to the reign of terror imposed by England on India in moments of crisis, a reign of terror to which, quote, all the injustice of former oppressors, Asiatic and European, appeared as a blessing, end quote. Things went no better for the colonies located in Europe. The friend and companion of Tocqueville on his voyage in America, Gustave de Beaumont, referring to Ireland, speaks of a religious oppression beyond all imagination. The bullying, the humiliations, and the suffering imposed by English tyranny on this enslaved people demonstrate that, quote, in human institutions there is a level of egoism and folly of which it is impossible to define its limits. Of the domination exercised by the British Empire over this unhappy island, he speaks of the extreme limits of evil, of an absolute evil. It is a description that, in our own days, is reserved for the Third Reich. Let's see what happened in the United States. The terror loomed over the black slaves is not astounding. A traveler described the situation in Virginia immediately after the revolt of 1831, led by Nat Turner. Quote, military service by the white patrollers is carried out night and day. Richmond resembles a besieged city. The Negroes don't risk communicating with each other for fear of being punished. End quote. More interesting is to note how the terror ended up affecting the white community itself. Here's the testimony of an important Union politician on the prevailing climate in the South in the years preceding the Civil War. The Abolitionist Party is not absent, but is, quote, forced into submission by fear. Those who oppose slavery, quote, do not dare even to exchange opinions with others who think as they do, out of fear of being betrayed, end quote. The historian of our own times who records this testimony concludes that, because of lynchings, violence, and threats of every kind, the South silenced not only all opposition, but even the mildest dissent. Beyond the abolitionists themselves, those who were and felt threatened were those who distanced themselves from this merciless witch hunt. All were forced by the terror, quote, to keep their mouths shut, to kill their own doubts, to bury their own reservations, end quote. There can be no doubt that this describes the efficacy of totalitarian terror and totalitarianism. Herbert Spencer, the liberal philosopher, describes how colonial expansionism, of which the traditionally liberal countries are often the protagonists, works. Quote, "After the expropriation of the defeated comes their extermination. Not only the Indians of North America and the natives of Australia are to pay this price. Resort to genocide was had in every corner of the British colonial empire. In India, quote, death was inflicted on entire regiments, guilty of having dared to disobey the tyrannical commands of their oppressors." Around 50 years later, Spencer felt obligated to increase the dosage. Quote, "We have entered an epoch of social cannibalism, in which the strongest nations are devouring the weakest. We should realize that the white savages of Europe are overcoming the dark savages everywhere. In effect, liberal Belgium reduced the indigenous population of the Congo from 20 to 40 million in 1890 to 8 million by 1911. End quote. Moreover, we have seen the genocide the United States practiced to strangle the Philippines' independence movement. Genocide was not only practiced, but was calmly and cheerfully theorized. We have seen Theodore Roosevelt theorize at the end of the 19th century, against rebellious colonial peoples, a, quote, war of extermination, one that would not spare women and children, end quote. It is eloquent testimony coming from the U.S. president and statesman who stated in an 1896 speech, quote, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th." End quote. But there is little to joke about. In the North American Republic, the voices calling for the extinction of the misfit and for a divine law of evolution, and who declare that on the agenda is a final solution to the Negro problem, were growing, which would happily substantially replicate the already carried out final solution to the U.S. American Indian problem. It is arbitrary to separate the darkest pages of the 20th century, written by Nazism and fascism, from the history of colonialism. Hitler sought to imitate Great Britain and the United States. He aimed to establish the German Indies in Eastern Europe, or to promote a form of colonial expansion similar to what had happened in the west of the North American Republic. It is in the course of the colonial and racial oppression of the latter against the indigenous and black people that there emerged what would become the key words of Nazi ideology: Underman/Untermensch and Ultimate Solution/Endlösung. The German colonial empire would have to be built on the forced labor of the indigenous people, the Slavs, reduced to conditions of slavery. Even this program based itself on a long-term history that went well beyond Germany. With the end of the U.S. Civil War, the black slaves were now replaced by, quote, coolies, semi-slaves from India or China. Independently of the coolies, colonial expansionism, even that of liberal countries, brought with it the imposition of modern forms of slavery or semi-slavery on the subject peoples. It is for this reason that Lenin, regarding the conflict between the great capitalist and colonialist powers in the First World War, spoke of the war between slave owners for the consolidation and reinforcement of slavery. Was this a polemical exaggeration? During the war in Egypt, peasants, surprised in the bazaar, were, quote, arrested and sent to the closest mobilization centers. To use the words of the conservative British historian A.J.P. Taylor, quote, around 50 million Africans and 250 million Indians were forced by England to fight and die en masse in a war of which they knew nothing. End quote. If the definition of slavery is the power of life and death exercised by the master, Lenin's characterization is fitting. Over their subject peoples, the great colonialist powers exercise the power of life and death. This power hung over the more or less servile labor force from their colonies that Britain and France sent to the front to dig trenches or do other heavy and dangerous work. In particular, this latter practice inspired the Third Reich, which, with a further level of brutality, forced a gigantic mass of slaves to work or to die of exhaustion and hunger to maintain the productive apparatus needed to conduct the war. Even regarding racial ideology, the continuity is clear. Here is a, quote, profession of racial faith from the early 20th century. Beginning of long quote. 1. Blood will tell. 2. The white race must dominate. 3. The Teutonic peoples stand for race purity. 4. The Negro is inferior and will remain so. 5. This is a white man's country. 6. No social equality. 7. No political equality. 10. Let there be such industrial education of the Negro as will best fit him to serve the white man. 14. Let the lowest white man count for more than the highest Negro. 15. The above statements indicate the leadings of Providence. End quote from C. Van Woodward, The Origins of the New South. Is this a Nazi manifesto? No, it is a manifesto from the United States, before the Nazi movement was founded in Germany, by armed men in uniform who paraded around for the, quote, Jubilee of white supremacy, and that were determined to use any means to maintain Aryan superiority in the servile or semi-servile conditions of black people. As far as the Empire of the Rising Sun was concerned, in our own time, a conservative historian of great success said of the Japanese that, quote, they ended up copying everything, from Western clothes and hairstyles to the European practice of colonizing foreign people. End quote from Niall Ferguson. Finally, the Italian nationalists, who merged into fascism in the name of colonial expansionism, went to school, quote, on Kipling and on Roosevelt, the British-American school of colonialism and imperialism. End quote from Benedetto Croce. The horrors of the colonialist system certainly did not end with the defeat of the Third Reich and its allies. Rather than turn to Algeria and Vietnam, I will limit myself here to the example of two tragedies that are perhaps less well known. Between 1952 and 59, the Mau Mau revolt broke out in Kenya. Utilizing the most recent historiography on the question, a prestigious liberal U.S. journal described the methods used by Britain's government to restore stability in the colony. In the Kamiti concentration camp, women, quote, were interrogated, whipped, reduced to starvation, and subjected to hard labor that included filling common graves with corpses from other concentration camps. Many gave birth at Kamiti, but the mortality rate among babies was shocking. Women buried their babies in bunches of 6 at a time. End quote. From Africa, let's move on to Latin America. In these same years, we find the United States not only installing ferocious military dictatorships, but also committing or helping to commit acts of genocide. The Guatemalan Truth Commission makes this clear, referring to the fate of the Mayans, guilty of having sympathized with the opponents of the regime favored by Washington. This world, made of slavery, semi-slavery, servile labor relations, monstrous forms of unfreedom, strident forms of discrimination, and frightening exclusionary clauses, sanctioned and tolerated by law. This world, after having undergone the first hard blows from the Jacobins in Paris, and above all from the Black Jacobins of San Domingue, was put into deep crisis by the communist movement, thanks to the direct action and the influence it exercised. That influence raised alarms even in the very heart of the capitalist metropoles. One thinks of the African Americans. They were oppressed by a regime of white supremacist terrorism when the October Revolution broke out, which then immediately spread a new spirit among the peoples of colonial origin. Rather than submit to oppression as a natural condition, and, in any case, an irresistible one, given the existing relations of power, they began to rebel. Here's an African American declaring in a challenging tone, quote, "If fighting for our rights means being Bolsheviks, then we're Bolsheviks, and people should have their souls at peace." In effect, the blacks who decided to throw off the colonial and racial yoke constituted an essential component of the Communist Party then forming. The whites who collaborated with them were also considered, quote, "foreigners," and members of inferior races, and treated as such. So what being a communist and challenging white supremacy meant, quote, was to face the possibility of imprisonment, beatings, kidnappings, and even death, end quote, from Robin D. G. Kelly, Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression. Those were the years of the Great Depression and unemployment and mass misery. But despite the bitter competition that ensued in the labor market, all of that did not silence the struggle against the regime of white supremacy, and it did not break the unity between whites and blacks engaged in that struggle, mostly organized by the Communist Party. Jumping ahead 2 decades, let's now look at the forms taken by the end of the regime of white supremacy. In December 1952, the Attorney General of the United States sent an eloquent appeal in a letter to the Supreme Court, which was hearing cases on the racial integration of public schools. He stated, quote, "Racial discrimination furnishes grist for the communist propaganda mills, and it raises doubts, even among friendly nations, as to the intensity of our devotion to the democratic faith." End quote. Washington, observes an American historian in our times, ran the risk of alienating, quote, "the colored races, not only in the East and throughout the Third World, but within the United States as well." Even there, communist propaganda was having considerable success in recruiting blacks to the revolutionary cause, destroying their, quote, "faith in American institutions." It was because of this concern that the U.S. Supreme Court declared racial segregation unconstitutional in public schools. In summary, we cannot understand how the regime of white supremacy was dismantled in the United States, itself a tenacious heritage of the world colonialist slavery system, without noting the challenge of the October Revolution and of the communist movement. End section.